All right, welcome back to another episode of the Podium Pushers podcast with Justin and Brandon. We have been witnessing an amazing 2024 Formula One season, but unfortunately, for some reason, we're in the midst of another 4-week break. We just endured the summer break, and for who knows what reason, we've got a fall break too, but that does not mean we are going anywhere. We have got something special planned for you guys today. Brandon, how you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I'm super excited for this episode. I think it's really unique, and I'm kind of going in blind a little bit, which is intentional. So I'm excited to see what we have here and see how you guys like it. But I'm excited for this episode.
Yeah, it's going to be a great episode because we are looking at what the 2024 Formula One season would be like without Max Verstappen or Lando Norris. They have been providing a great year. We've seen a lot of great races, we've seen different winners, but maybe we're not quite seeing a championship battle yet. And so we decided to take the top two in the championship out of this season and see what the table would look like, see if we would have different winners, new winners, potentially an even better championship battle. Brandon, are you ready to react to this?
I'm ready to react to this. I'm excited to see where kind of everybody stacks up. I know Oscar's been really good at the end, but I know Charles and Carlos were doing well at the beginning of the season. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Valtteri Bottas will have some points in there or something. Who knows? Who knows what could happen? But
Well, I don't want to spoil it, but Valtteri Bottas is actually the only driver in this scenario that
dang
doesn't
it.
score any points all
Dang
season
it.
long. Even Logan Sargent managed to score points at the British Grand Prix in this scenario, but Valtteri Bottas still hasn't scored points. Let's jump right in. It would have been the Bahrain Grand Prix won by Sergio Perez this time, with the podium consisting of Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc in P2 and P3. But the win would have only been about 8 seconds from Sergio Perez. So maybe after round one, we'd already be thinking that Red Bull wasn't as dominant as they were last year.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, yeah, I mean Sergio winning a race that would put him in the lead of the championship, but that would obviously put Ferrari in the constructors championship lead. Be interesting. But yeah, I mean, an 8 second win is not as dominant as what we saw Max do, obviously, at Bahrain. So,
Yeah, just some simple ground rules here before we go any further. This is just Max and Lando gone. I didn't decide any different scenarios of something someone would have done different because they're gone. It's just them removed. Also, fastest laps, I just took it out unless someone who was still in the race already had the point. I kept it in if they did that, but I didn't go in and add old fastest laps because who knows who would have done what with a pit stop. And also, I didn't do any constructor standings because obviously Ferrari would have won because McLaren and Red Bull would be fighting by themselves. Well, Red Bull kind of already is fighting with one driver, but not the
yeah.
driver included in this one. But yes, now we can move on to Saudi Arabia, which was won again by Sergio Perez with Charles Leclerc in P2 and Oscar Piastri in P3. So we're looking at a Sergio Perez back-to-back victories to start out the year.
That's crazy. But Charles Leclerc, two podiums on the balance to start off the season. Um, be interesting. I don't know. This is interesting to think about, but I think that if Sergio started out the season with two wins, um, that would be crazy. He probably would have less rumors about him right now, but there's a lot of rumors going on about Sergio right now, and they never seem to stop. So
Yeah, well, unfortunately, he did not start the season out with 2 wins. And in this scenario, he did not start it out with 3 wins because then we went to Australia and didn't have to change anything about the winner because Carlos Sainz won that race in real life and won that race in this scenario as well. Charles Leclerc P2 and Oscar Piastri P3. And we're going to see a lot through this scenario that there's quite some consistency from the Ferrari boys. They love themselves some podiums, even a couple wins in this. But I think we're going to see some drivers in this scenario have had quite an underrated, consistent year for sure.
yeah, I mean, even if you look at Oscar Piastri in this scenario, he's already got two podiums. Uh, it's crazy. Oscar put this is making me realize that maybe Oscar put together a better front half of the season than everybody thinks he did.
Don't worry, we're not going to mention his name for a couple rounds here. We would move into Japan, where Sergio Perez would get back to his winning ways with Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc also on the podium, and then we would go to China, where Lewis Hamilton would win the first sprint of the year. First time we've heard Mercedes in this, and Sergio Perez would win another Grand Prix, once again accompanied on the podium by the Ferrari teammates of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz.
Yeah, that's some scary good consistency from Ferrari and Sergio Perez. 4 wins on the season. 4 wins in 2024 for Sergio Perez. That's crazy. What a year he's having so far.
What a year he's having. Was that potentially the last time I will say his name on this list? Who knows?
Who
Then
knows?
we would go to Miami and have another sprint race. This time it would be won by Charles Leclerc, who would follow that up by winning the main race in Miami as well, joined by Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz on the podium.
Yeah, more consistency from Sergio, more consistency from Charles and Carlos. Um, I mean, I think at this point we would have a pretty close battle between Sergio and Charles for the championship, which that would be pretty exciting to see. I mean, I think everybody would assume that Charles would have it locked up, even though he's down maybe 25 points because the inevitable Sergio slump. But well,
That is true. Right now in the point standings, Sergio Perez is ahead of Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri. In Imola and Monaco, we would have the exact same podium of Charles Leclerc P1, Oscar Piastri P2, and Carlos Sainz P3, which is maybe going to show that Carlos Sainz, having to miss a race for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix with his appendix out, is actually having quite a big effect on this standings because he's had some pretty crazy consistency, but missed one round where everyone else scored a lot of points.
that's true. And I mean, even if you think about that without the context of Max and Lando being gone in our scenario, I mean, Ollie Behrman scored points for Ferrari in Saudi, but had Carlos been in that race, you could argue that he would have finished higher than Ollie Behrman, and that would have helped Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship a little bit more. I know it's probably not a ton of points, but every point counts in the Constructors' Championship right now, and that extra maybe, I don't know, 6, 8 points from Ferrari uh, could make a difference. We'll see.
We absolutely will. Then we would go to Canada, where Mercedes make their first appearance on the top step. George Russell would win that race from Lewis Hamilton and Oscar Piastri before we would go to Spain, where Lewis Hamilton would lead home a Mercedes 1-2 from George Russell and Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, that's crazy. Another podium by Charles and a couple of race wins by Mercedes. What does the driver's standings look like now? How are the Mercedes boys faring?
The Mercedes are fourth and fifth, or just kidding, fifth and sixth in the driver standings right now. So unfortunately, if you remember in real life and reflected so in this, they had a pretty slow start to the year. Obviously, you didn't really see them on the podium, even in this scenario. Lewis Hamilton did get that sprint win in this situation, but they definitely have some ground to catch up at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. I'm excited to see how they fare because in real life, this is kind of where Mercedes really picked things up. I mean, in Canada, George got that pole qualifying. It's crazy. And then they really kind of turned it on to go into the summer break. So excited to see what happens.
Well, we would have two more Mercedes wins in the next Grand Prix. Austria, Oscar Piastri would win the sprint, but George Russell would come home with P1 in the race, followed by Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz, which is the same podium that happened in real life because
Yeah,
Lando Norris and Max Verstappen decided to take themselves out of this race, so made my job pretty easy. But in Great Britain, Lewis Hamilton would win that race, followed by Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz.
yeah. Where does Oscar stand now?
I gotta be honest with you, man. I don't have the points total after each race, but he's got to be getting back in there because he's had a pretty consistent run right now.
Yeah, he has. He's been mentioned in several podiums. Um, but yeah, I thought you had the points tallied after every race. But oh
I
well.
don't, unfortunately. That would have been quite a bit of work for podcast prep, and I should have done that. You're totally right.
Okay.
But
Okay.
this is still going to be a great episode, and I do have the full points tally at the end. Don't you worry. So we will get a full standings update after this. But speaking of Oscar Piastri, he would still get his first win in Hungary, which was something that was quite surprising to me. I thought he would have won a Grand Prix before Hungary in this scenario, but he did not. Hungary is still his first win, followed home by Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc on the podium.
Yeah, another podium for Charles Leclerc, another Mercedes podium during this strong stretch. Um, yeah, in real life, Lando obviously finished P2. Was Max P3 in that race?
No, Max finished behind Charles Leclerc in this race after he came together with Lewis Hamilton at turn one. So it was already a pretty poor race for Max Verstappen. So Lando Norris being gone and Charles Leclerc being added is the only thing that changed about this podium.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, another consistent showing from Charles Leclerc. So,
Then we would go to Spa, where Lewis Hamilton, Oscar Piastri, and Charles Leclerc would make up the podium, which is the exact same as what happened in real life.
yeah, after George Russell's disqualification, mighty unfortunate, but yeah, that was a great race.
Yep. And then we would go to the Dutch Grand Prix and the Italian Grand Prix, which would have the exact same podiums of Charles Leclerc in P1, Oscar Piastri in P2, and Carlos Sainz in P3.
Yeah, more consistency from Ferrari. I really think that Charles might be leading the championship at the end of all of this. That I don't know. I'll say my guesses before the final reveal, but I don't know.
Yeah, it really makes you think that Charles Leclerc might be having a bit of an underrated season in real life if he's been having these performances in this scenario. We would then go to Azerbaijan, which would feature the exact same podium as what we saw in real life of Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, and George Russell.
Oscar Piastri. Yeah, it's more consistency from Oscar. Another Mercedes podium, which obviously we saw that happen in real life, but yeah,
Yep. And then it would be two wins in a row for Oscar Piastri because he would also have won the Singapore Grand Prix,
yeah,
followed by George Russell and Charles Leclerc.
yep. More consistency from George Russell, more consistency from Charles, and yeah, another Oscar win.
Yep, and so that would bring us to where we are right now. So here's a quick wrap up of some of the top drivers' stats in this scenario. Charles Leclerc would have 5 wins, 1 sprint win, and 10 additional podiums. Oscar Piastri would have 3 wins, 1 sprint win, and 10 additional podiums. Carlos Sainz would have 1 win and 10 podiums. George Russell would have 2 wins and 3 podiums. Lewis Hamilton, 3 wins, a sprint win, and 2 podiums. And Sergio Perez would have 4 wins and only one additional podium.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Let me let me guess maybe the top 10
Okay, go ahead.
drivers
Go ahead.
starting with 10th.
10th. Okay. We're going top to bottom. I like it.
Yeah. So in 10th place, I'm gonna say maybe Fernando Alonso.
It is not Fernando Alonso. Man, I thought you were gonna say it. It was Yuki Tsunoda.
Okay. I was literally debating between the two of them.
I know. I saw your mouth start to form Yuki, and I was like, do it. And then you switched to Fernando last second. It was Yuki Tsunoda who really benefited from this. He has 47 points. So if you remember
Hey,
back to the beginning of the year, Yuki Tsunoda put in some pretty good performances in the RB. In the scenario, he and Daniel Ricciardo almost have the same number of point scoring appearances. But because that RB has been worse towards the end of the year, Daniel was getting maybe 2 or 1 points per race. Yuki Tsunoda had some rounds where he picked up 10 and 8 points, really racked up a good points haul for him. Daniel Ricciardo wound up in P13 with 25 points, but Yuki Tsunoda was the driver in P10.
yeah, that's crazy. 47 points. That's huge for Yuki. Um, let's see. Ninth place. Hmm.
You
This
got
is
this.
tough. We're
Uh,
kind of in no man's
This
land,
is an
right?
easy one. This is an easy one right here.
Easy
Just
one. I thought
just
is
think
it
of
between
who would fit in right here before we start to get to some bigger boys.
Fernando Alonso?
No, it's Lance Stroll, Fernando Alonso's
Really?
teammate. Yeah, it's
Oh my
Lance
God.
Stroll in P9. He actually only has one more point than Yuki Tsunoda. Tsunoda had 47, Stroll has 48. And so, yes, maybe a little disappointing of a year. from Lance Stroll. Definitely still has quite the gap to Fernando Alonso, but did do enough to secure P9.
Okay. Okay. So P8, I mean, I feel like I should guess Fernando, but I don't want to guess Fernando three times in a row because that's boring.
Yeah, there's one more driver who's been having a solid year, scoring points consistently, who in this scenario would pick up some more higher scoring points.
Hmm. Okay. Maybe a little off the wall, but
Don't say Alex Albon.
this is for P8. I'm not guessing Alex Albon. I'm going to go Nico
It
Hulkenberg.
is Nico Hulkenberg,
Yes. Okay.
57 points. Nico Hulkenberg, P8 in the Haas. Very impressive year from Nico Hulkenberg in this scenario. He was P8.
Yeah, I think that just highlights how impressive Nico's year has been regardless. I mean, for him to be in our fake scenario with taking out Max and Lando, for him to be in the conversation of like the top 10 in the points, that's incredible. So that's awesome. Um, so P7, Fernando Alonso.
Yes, it is
Okay.
Fernando
Okay.
Alonso with 110 points. So solid year from Fernando Alonso. He did not make the podium in this scenario, unfortunately, but he did have a couple of P4s at the beginning of the year that bolstered his points tally, and so he was P7.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. P6. Is it too early? I'm gonna go Sergio Perez.
It is not Sergio Perez. It
Oh,
is George Russell with
okay.
215 points. That disqualification really hurting him there. Also had some unfortunate DNFs, which hurt him a lot in this because the drivers around him inherited those points. He wouldn't have been near Max Orlando in the standings anyways. But I think of that DNF at Silverstone, which wasn't his fault, and then that DNF at Australia, which was his fault. The Silverstone one obviously would have been an easy podium, and then the Australia one in this scenario would have been a podium as well. So George Russell let some points slip away. He is P6 with 215 points.
Yeah, that's still an impressive showing from George Russell though. P5. I'm gonna go Sergio Perez.
It is Sergio Perez with
Okay. Yeah.
216 points. He's
One
only
more
1
point.
point in front of George Russell. And originally, I had him in P6 and George Russell in P5. Then I realized I forgot the sprint from China when I originally did this, so I had to go back, add that. Sergio Perez was elevated 1 point above George Russell from that sprint, so barely holding on to P5, which is interesting. Obviously, the wins help him out in this because in real life, he is bottom of Formula A. He's in P8 right now in the real driver standings, but holding on to P5 in this one.
Yeah. Okay, next P4. It's kind of tough here, but I'm gonna go with Carlos Sainz.
It is Lewis Hamilton with
Ah,
238 points. That consistency for Carlos Sainz helping him out, keeping him ahead of Lewis Hamilton. He is the driver who is in P3. I'll go ahead and give you that. I'm sure you knew that was coming. It's only a 6 point gap between them, so would be quite the interesting battle to the end of the year. But that is how it's shaping up.
yeah. And then P2, I'm gonna have to go with Oscar,
It is Oscar Piastri in P2, yes.
and then Charles Leclerc, obviously
Yes,
P1.
Charles Leclerc is P1. So 6 races left, 3 sprints. What do you think the points gap is between these two drivers right now?
Right now, Charles had 5 wins
Yeah.
and 10 additional podiums.
hmm
Oscar had 3 wins, a
hmm
sprint, and 10 additional podiums.
Yeah, both drivers won a sprint race. So
Okay. I think the gap's got to be around maybe like 48 points.
it's 12 points between them right now.
12 points.
Yeah, because
Okay.
you got to think there was that gap in the middle of the year where Charles Leclerc had some retirements. Even in this scenario, he didn't score points in Great Britain. He still managed to only score 1 point in Austria. So Charles Leclerc had a pretty inconsistent middle of the year, which still hurts him, and he only has a 12-point lead over Oscar Piastri in this. So in this scenario, 6 races left, 3 sprints. Who do you think would come out on top as we got towards the end of the year?
That's tough. I would have to say Oscar. Oscar's had kind of the hotter hand towards the end of the season, or closer to this point of the season. So I would say Oscar's going to come out on top. But I mean, a 12-point gap is nothing. So, I mean, that's a P1 and P3. The whole thing's flipped.
Yeah.
So,
So that would absolutely be crazy. An even better championship battle than what we have right now. And I would have to say that Charles Leclerc is going to win it. I made this point a couple podcasts ago, and I still believe it to be true, even though he's not in contention for the Drivers' Championship in real life. But we've got some tracks coming up that Charles Leclerc is very good at. I don't think we've seen the last Charles Leclerc victory of 2024. And so in this scenario, I would have to back Charles Leclerc to hold on from Oscar Piastri.
yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I've always thought that Charles Leclerc is a championship caliber driver given the right car. And in this scenario, he would have the right car. So I don't know. And in real life in 2025, maybe Ferrari will have the right car. I don't know. Their development has looked pretty good this season, not as good as McLaren's, but I mean they're right there. So
Yeah, 2025. We just might be seeing the championship battle that we're witnessing right here. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but potentially that first and second might be the top driver at Ferrari and the top driver of McLaren next year. But I don't want to make any bold predictions right now. We will have an entire off season to make our 2025 championship predictions. But that is all we have for this fantasy scenario episode of the Podium Pusher podcast, which has been very fun to look at. Brandon, what are your parting podium thoughts before we leave these lovely people?
parting podium thoughts is, man, what a season it would have been if Max and Lando weren't in it. Just kidding. It's been great to watch Max and Lando duke it out a little bit, and I'm excited to see who comes out on top in Austin, Texas, which is where we'll be in just a few days. So exciting times here at the Podium Pushers, exciting times in Formula One, exciting times down in Austin. It's a great time to be alive. Great time to be an F1 fan.
An absolutely incredible time to be an F1 fan. We're only 2 weeks away from being in Austin. My parting podium thought is going to be a question to you. I'm putting you on the spot here. When we see this fantasy scenario that Sergio Perez only got 4 wins and 1 podium in the absence of Max Verstappen, is this proof that he has been the backup driver that Red Bull need, getting some wins and scoring some points? Or is it proof that he hasn't been the backup driver that Red Bull needs and shouldn't be the driver they have going forward?
That's a great question. So when you look at this scenario, you've got 4 wins and one additional podium. It's only
Mhm.
5 podiums over the course of the year. Um, I mean, and then you look at the other drivers who are in front of him in the standings, the 4 other drivers that are in front of him,
Mhm.
almost 5 by literally just 1 point.
Yeah.
And they've been really, really consistent. And I think one thing that Sergio that has hurt Sergio in real life is his inconsistency, his inability to string great performances together. Um, so I would make the case that this would be evidence for him that he has not been the backup driver the Red Bull needs. Um, I think this is just kind of a more dramatic exaggeration of what happened in real life because, him getting those 4 wins and then being absolutely nowhere for 12 rounds, 12 races, So I don't know. What does it say? I mean, I think you can make cases for both sides, but for me personally, I would say the inconsistency and winning 4 races, the second most out of any driver, but only being P5 in the standings, that does not seem to cut it. But I'm not Helmut Marko. So
Yeah, well, who knows what's going on with Red Bull and Helmut Marko anyways. I would have to agree because 3 of those wins were already P2s and 1 win was a P3 behind Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. So those were already podiums that he had guaranteed and then he inherited this extra podium. So I don't think this scenario flatters Sergio Perez much at all. If anything, it highlights how poor his year has been compared to all of the other drivers. And then to see obviously Oscar Piastri ahead of him, which is Ferrari's second driver, to see Carlos Sainz, Ferrari second driver, Oscar Piastri, McLaren second driver, and George Russell, Mercedes second driver, only 1 point behind him. I think it does clearly show that he is probably at the bottom of Formula A, but we'll just have to see what Red Bull does going forward into 2025 and or 2026. Who's to say? But that is all we have got for this episode of the Podium Pushers podcast. As always, thank you guys for watching or listening. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment, all of the things. We really appreciate each and every person who watches and listens to our content. It means the world to us. We will be back next week for another thrilling fall break episode of the Podium Pushers podcast, and we will see you in the next one.
See ya.